Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Seabird's podcast. Today's guest is Edward Willett. Hi, Edward.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Welcome to my podcast. Thank you for coming on. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm the award-winning author of more than 60 books of science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction for readers from elementary school up through adults. I also am a podcaster. I have my own podcast called The Worldshapers, where I interview other science fiction and fantasy authors about the creative process. And on the side, I'm also an actor and singer. I've done professional stage work. Not a lot, but some.
Wow, that's awesome. So when did you first realize you wanted to become an author?
Pretty early on. I wrote my first complete short story when I was 11 years old. It was called Castor Glass Hypership Test Pilot, which was, shows where my mind already was at the age of 11. And I kept writing through high school. I wrote like 3 novels in high school and shared them with my classmates, and they seemed to like them. And I thought, maybe I can tell stories. Although I actually started as a journalist, I realized you can't actually make a living as a writer right off the bat usually. And so, although my long-term goal has always been to write fiction, I began as a newspaper reporter and editor, and then a lot of my freelance work continues to be nonfiction. So I kind of had that whole mixture of writing. But I became a full-time freelance writer coming up on 30 years ago. 2 more years, it'll be 30 years that I've been full-time writer.
That's amazing. And so where do you get your ideas from when you think of your stories?
They can come from anywhere. This is a question I always ask my guests on my podcast too. So I do think about it quite a bit, but every story is different where the idea comes from. It could be from something that I've read or something. For example, I had a book called Andy Nebula, Interstellar Rockstar, which is out there now as From the Street to the Stars, it's called now. You can find it. And it came about because I was working at the Saskatchewan Science Center, which I did for a few years as communications officer. And we had an exhibit about how memory works. And about the same time, I read something about pop stars, teen girl pop stars in Japan, and how they'd be like really famous for 1 month and then they were washed up. And I put those two things together, and that's where we got Andy Nebula, Interstellar Rockstar, because I have aliens who use a different kind of memory than we do. Their memory is different. And my main character gets basically plucked off the streets and turned into this big interstellar rock star. So that's an example of taking things that I read, or it could be an image like I have a book called The City Born, and that started as the image of a city crouched over a ravine, and had been there so long that the ravine was filled up with all of its garbage, very like a canyon really filled with its garbage. And then I have a series called The Shards of Excalibur, and that was simply from walking around the lake not far from my house on a foggy morning and thinking there could be anything in that lake. And I decided the Lady of the Lake from King Arthur was in that lake, and that was the start of that series.
Wow.
So ideas can come from anywhere.
That's awesome. Wow. I'm not really into sci-fi, but that sounds really interesting. The first book that you was talking about, that sounds really interesting. So can we purchase the books on your website?
You can find, I actually have a dedicated shop site called edwardwillettshop.com, but there's a link to it from my main website. And I also have my own little publishing company for some projects, and it's called Shadowpaw Press. And if you go to shadowpawpress.com, that's one of the places you can find Andy Nebula's story in the Shards of Excalibur in ebook format as well.
That's awesome. So what does your family think about your writing?
Well, as I often say, my best career move as a freelance writer was marrying an engineer. So she's an engineer, and she's happy that I'm a writer. We both wish that I sold way more books than I do. That would be nice. So buy those books. I'll put my daughter through university, which is where she is right now. But I think we kind of got together through musical theater, actually. But I've read most of my books to her. I read out loud quite a bit to her when she's cooking, actually, is the way it works in our house. And I have had great support from my family.
That's amazing. So who are a few of your favorite authors, and have any of them inspired any of your novels?
Well, my big ones growing up, because I'm quite old, were Robert A. Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, that kind of era of science fiction writers, which they were the big three at one point. But we're talking 60s when I was really starting to read, 60s and 70s. And then people like Andre Norton, C.S. Lewis, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, all those sort of big names in the field influenced me. And then these days I read more widely, but I wouldn't say that any specific author has influenced me, except maybe Robert A. Heinlein and Andre Norton, she wrote a lot of young adult fantasy and science fiction. And I think there's a strong tinge of her way of telling stories in my books as well.
Okay.
Oddly enough, my agent is actually the agent for her estate, so there's that weird connection there.
Wow, that's cool. So what was your hardest scene to write and why?
My hardest scene, I don't know. That's a hard one to answer. Scenes come to me pretty readily. The challenge is always the climactic scenes and making sure that you have that big bang and that you get all the moving pieces moving in the right direction and that you tie up all the plot threads. So I would say no matter what the book is, it's usually that sort of climactic scene toward the end. It can actually be very exhilarating to write, but you do have to always make sure that you're not leaving huge gaping plot holes open that people will notice. And that's where editors come in. Editors are good at helping you to spot the things that you forgot to say.
Definitely. So what advice would you give to help others who want to pursue a writing career?
The number one advice is to read widely, read a lot of stuff, read especially in the field in which you want to write, but read outside it as well. But if you do want to write science fiction and fantasy, you have to read science fiction and fantasy. If you want to write romance, you have to read romance novels. If you want to write Westerns, does anybody write Westerns anymore? I don't know. But you should read Westerns. Mystery is actually one I was aiming for. So that's my first advice always, is to read. I think a lot of the techniques of writing, you can take classes and mentorships and all that stuff, but it really comes from osmosis and absorbing the way that other people tell stories. And it needs to be the way that they tell them in books as opposed to the way they tell them in TV and movies, because they're very different mediums. So read. And then the other thing is, it's not very exciting, but you have to do the work. You have to write. You have to write a bunch of stuff that's no good in order to get to the point where you're writing something that maybe isn't bad.
Yes, I agree. That's great advice, because I get stuck and then I'll let my family read it, and my brother, he's pretty harsh when he gives like his opinion. So he was like, this is not good at all. Like he was like, start all over. And I'm like, dang, it's like that. But yeah, I agree with you. I do.
A good solid critique from somebody who doesn't like your books, assuming that it's a fair critique, is actually more helpful than like your mom saying, "Oh, you wrote a book. That's wonderful, dear."
Yeah, like just sugarcoating it. My mom wouldn't sugarcoat it either. She would tell me the honest truth too. They're both pretty blunt. But I wanted to ask you, could you give our listeners just like a few of your books, like a sip, how do you pronounce it? A synopsis? No, just like details of your book, like about what your book is about.
Well, the most recent thing I have is a series from Daw Books called Worldshaper. Daw Books is my publisher in New York. There's 3 of them so far. The 4th one will be coming out from me directly, but it will continue. So it's called Worldshaper. The second one's called The Moonlit World. The second one's called Master of the World. The third one's called The Moonlit World. And it's set in this labyrinth of shaped worlds where there are people who are from our world, have been given their own worlds to shape however they want. And my main character discovers that she's one of these shapers. She's forgotten it. Nobody knows why in the first book. So the first world is a lot like ours. The second world she goes into because she's trying to save them all from this external threat. The second one is in the Master of the World is the Jules Verne-like world. So it's all steampunk and airships and submarines and things like that. And then the Moonlit World, which is the most recent one and will be out in mass market paperback this summer. It's out now in ebook and trade paperback. Is, I like to call it Werewolves and Vampires and Peasants. Oh my, because it's a world shaped by people who really like werewolves and vampires and stuff. So that's my most recent from my big publisher. My most recent from myself is a book called Blue Fire, which is published under one of my pseudonyms, E.C. Blake. You can get that at Shadowpaw Press, and it's a young adult epic fantasy about 3 very different young people who have to work together to save their kingdom from being destroyed when somebody bad gets hold of blue fire, which is basically electricity controlled by magic. It's That's what that boils down to. How's that for a really short synopsis? And then the other thing I like to mention is that through my podcast, I kickstarted 2 anthologies, one of which is out. It's called Shapers of World, and it's short stories by people who were on my podcast in the first year. And I just successfully kickstarted Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, which is short stories by people who are on my podcast in the second year. And I'm working on that now, and it'll be out this fall. And these are big name authors, and they're international bestsellers and award winners and all that. So that's something else to look for, and that's through Shadow Paw Press as well.
Wow. So on your website, we could find your podcast on there too?
Yep. The sidebar has links to all this stuff, my podcast and I walk around Regina every day and live stream it. So that's something else you can find on YouTube if that interests you at all. But there's links on my website to everything. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. And I've linked your website below. So if anybody wants to check it out.
Please do.
So what do you enjoy doing when you're not writing or reading?
Well, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of theater and music, and I've done it professionally, but mostly I've done it for fun. So whenever I can, I enjoy doing musical theater. I've written some shows and directed them and performed in them. And I've sung in a lot of choirs, so I've done a lot of that kind of singing as well. So music is always something. And then I guess our other interest, and my wife has the interest in musical theater as well, so that works out well. And then my other... I have a real interest in wine, so we often go to wine dinners and I'll go to the wine country and tour wineries and things like that. That's something else. And then, the usual things. I like to read, oddly enough.
So have you all ever been to Louisville, Kentucky? We have a nice winery here.
I have been to Kentucky, but not when I was drinking wine. When I went to school in Arkansas and with Harding University, which is affiliated with the Churches of Christ. And that is a non-drinking church. And I was a non-drinker at that time.
That's awesome. I want to thank you so much, Edward, for coming on my show today and speaking with me about your podcast and your novels and your publishing company.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye. Hey, everyone. I want to thank you so much for supporting my podcast and for listening to my podcast and listening to my interview with Edward. So if you would like to purchase any of his novels or follow his stream or check out his podcast, you can go to the link that's tinkering below and you can find out more information about Edward. You can contact him that way. You can email him. You can follow his blog. You can look at his videos, listen to some of his music. I want to thank you all so much for supporting my podcast. I hope y'all continue to support my podcast and follow and share and like and comment and just be active in it. I want to thank you all so much. You all have a great day.